The champagne is untouched. The candles are burning low. And he's standing across the room in Venice looking at me like I'm something he's been trying not to want for centuries. Like the warning he gave me months ago is dissolving in real time, right here, right now, and he can't stop it. He said it so clearly. Don't expect love from me. Said it like a door closing. Like mercy. But I'm standing here in white lace on our wedding night, and I finally understand what that warning actually was. It wasn't a wall. It was a confession from a man already terrified of what he felt. Let me take you back to where this began, to a Tuesday night in Birmingham, Alabama, when I was nobody and he walked in and ruined everything. I was good at being invisible. I want you to understand that. It wasn't something that happened to me. It was something I built deliberately over years, the way you board up a house after a flood. Careful, methodical, board by board until the light stopped getting in, and you told yourself that was fine. That dark was safe. That safe was enough. My name is Alexa Simmons. I am 38 years old. I work a double shift at a diner off Highway 280 in Birmingham that smells like burnt coffee and the specific kind of loneliness that only settles into places open past midnight. My feet hurt by hour 5. By hour 9, they're just a dull, distant fact, like most things in my life by then. Present. Acknowledged. Ignored. I used to have more. I used to be more. There was a marriage, once, a man who said he loved me in a way that, slowly, quietly, took up all the space where I used to live. And then my mother got sick, and I spent 2 years watching the only person who ever made me feel fully seen disappear room by room, memory by memory, until one morning she looked at me and didn't know my face. She died in the spring. I buried her alone. My husband had already left by then, which was almost a relief, because grief is a private country and I didn't want a witness who'd already stopped caring. After that, I got small. On purpose. Small meant nothing could reach you. Small meant you moved through the world without leaving a mark, and the world returned the courtesy. I waited tables. I kept my apartment clean. I called my sister on Sundays and said I'm fine with enough practice that I'd almost stopped knowing it was a lie. I had a routine. Routine is the architecture of survival when you don't have anything else to build with. Tuesday nights were always slow. The after-dinner crowd thinned out around 9, and by 11 it was just the insomniacs, the long-haul drivers, the people who couldn't be alone with the silence of their own homes. I understood them. I served them coffee and I didn't ask questions, and we had an unspoken agreement. I wouldn't see them, and they wouldn't see me. There are women in this city I'd noticed over the years. A particular kind of woman. You'd catch them sometimes at odd hours, at gas stations, outside hospitals, sitting in parked cars with their hands in their laps and their eyes focused on something that wasn't there. They had a stillness about them. Not peace. Something older than peace. Something that had been through fire and come out the other side, not destroyed, but altered. I used to wonder about them. I never knew what to make of them. I do now. The bell above the door chimed at 11:47 p.m. I didn't look up right away. I was refilling the sugar dispensers, and I'd learned not to look up for every bell. Looking up meant hoping, and hope was a habit I'd broken. So I heard him before I saw him. The way the room changed. The way the 2 truckers at the counter went quiet without knowing why. The way old Hetty in the corner booth stopped stirring her tea and looked up from her crossword with eyes gone suddenly careful. Then I looked up. He was tall. Still in a way that felt deliberate, the stillness of something that is chosen, very carefully, how much of itself to reveal. Dark suit. No tie. Eyes that were almost wrong in a color I couldn't name in the fluorescent light, somewhere between storm and shadow. He didn't scan the room the way people do, when they're deciding where to sit. He already knew where he was going to sit. He already knew everything about this room. He moved to the booth by the window and he sat and he looked at the rain on the glass, and something about the set of his shoulders made my chest ache in a way I couldn't explain. Ancient. That was the word that arrived in my mind. Unbidden and strange. He looked ancient. Not old. Ancient. I brought the coffee without being asked. He ordered it black, which I'd already known somehow. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't look at the menu. He watched the rain the way I imagined you'd watch rain if you'd seen 1,000 years of it. Not bored, but full of something that had no name in any language I spoke. I cleared the next table. My mother's ring slipped from my finger, loose since I'd lost the weight of that grief year. I'd never gotten it resized, and it hit the floor and skidded under his booth. My stomach dropped. That ring was the last thing she'd put in my hand. The last morning she'd known who I was. She'd pressed it into my palm and said my name the way she used to say it when I was small, like it was something she was proud of. Like Alexa was a word that meant beloved. I crouched down to find it. He was already holding it out to me. Our fingers didn't touch when I took it. But he looked at me, really looked, and said, in a voice like low thunder over still water, "Be careful with that, Alexa Simmons. Some things can't be recovered once they're lost." I stood up. My heart was somewhere in my throat. I had not told him my name. I stood there holding my mother's ring, and I didn't move. That's the part one keep coming back to. Not the fear, though it was there, a cold thread pulling tight beneath my ribs. Not the confusion. What I keep returning to is the stillness. The way my body just stopped. Like something deep in me recognized what my mind hadn't caught up to yet. Like the part of you that knows things before you're ready to know them had already made a decision, and the rest of me was just waiting to be informed. He hadn't said it like a threat. That's what undid me. He said it the way you say the name of someone you've been thinking about for a long time. Quietly. Like it cost him something to say it out loud. Alexa Simmons. 2 words. My whole name. And I felt it the way you feel a hand on your shoulder in a dark room. Not pain, not danger, but the sudden, devastating awareness that you are no longer alone. I should have walked away. I know that. I am 38 years old. I have made enough bad decisions to recognize the shape of one, the particular feeling of standing at the edge of something irreversible and feeling the pull anyway, the way the body sometimes wants what the mind knows better than to want. I know that feeling. I have the scars to prove I know that feeling. I sat down across from him instead. Not because I was brave. Because my legs stopped working and the booth was right there, and some part of me understood that this conversation was happening whether I was seated or not. He didn't seem surprised. He didn't seem anything exactly. He watched me the way those old portraits watch you in museums. Eyes that follow, that hold, that carry something in them you can't quite read from where you're standing. How do you know my name? My voice came out steadier than I deserved. He looked at me for a long moment. The rain was loud against the window. Old Hetty had gone back to her crossword, but I noticed her pencil wasn't moving. I know a great many things, he said, that I haven't been told. It was not an answer. It was also not nothing. It was a door left deliberately ajar, the kind of door that tells you everything about the person who left it that way. He wanted me to push it open. He was also, I realized slowly, hoping I wouldn't. That contradiction. That tension between wanting to be known and being terrified of it. I recognized it the way you recognize a song from a life you've mostly stopped living. From somewhere behind your own breastbone. I turned the ring over in my fingers. The small diamond caught the diner light and threw it back in pieces. My mother gave me this, I said. I don't know why I told him that. I hadn't told anyone that. It had been 2 years since she died, and I hadn't said those words. My mother gave me this, out loud to a single living person. They'd been sitting in my chest like something I was holding in trust for a grief I still hadn't finished. Something moved in his expression. Not pity. Pity I would have recognized, and it would have made me leave. This was older than pity. This was the look of someone who understood loss not as a season, but as a permanent climate. Someone who had built their entire existence around the knowledge that everything ends and kept choosing to be present anyway. It broke something open in me. Quietly. The way ice cracks in early spring, not dramatic, just the slow, inevitable surrender of something that has been holding too long. She sounds like she mattered, he said. 3 words. And I felt my eyes fill in a way they hadn't since the funeral, since standing at a grave in April rain, completely alone, understanding for the first time what it means when the one person who made you feel real is simply gone. Not estranged, not lost.
Gone.
The specific, total, permanent gone that no one prepares you for. I pressed my lips together and looked at the window. The rain distorted the highway lights into long gold ribbons. She was the only person who ever said my name like it meant something. I said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that holds weight, that two people create together when words would be too small for what's happening. Then he said, low and even, some names do mean something. Yours is one of them. I looked back at him. And he was watching me, not the way men watch women they want something from, not appraising, not calculating. He was watching me the way you watch something you already know is going to cost you everything, and you're still deciding whether it's worth it. I understood in that moment that he was as afraid of this conversation as I was. That terrified me more than anything else. Because I knew, with the full weight of 38 years of hard-won self-knowledge, that I was not going to walk out of this diner and let this be a strange Tuesday night I eventually forgot. I was going to ask his name. I was going to say yes to whatever came next. And the part of me that had spent a decade becoming invisible was already grieving the decision because she knew, she had always known, that being seen is the most dangerous thing in the world. It is also, sometimes, the only thing worth surviving for. 3 days passed. I worked my shifts. I slept in the particular shallow way I'd perfected over years of being too tired to rest properly, 4 hours, maybe 5, the surface of sleep without ever going under. I refold the napkins at the diner into their little triangles. I smiled at people who didn't see me. I told myself Tuesday night was an anomaly, a strange hour and a strange man, and a grief that had been sitting too long without air. I told myself I'd imagined the way he said my name. I almost believed it. His name was Damon Ho-Chin. I'd looked it up. Of course I'd looked it up, and found what you find when you search for very powerful, very private men, a surface. A curated, smooth, deliberately uninformative surface. The Ho-Chin Group. Headquarters outside Birmingham. Real estate, private equity, historic preservation. A name attached to buildings and endowments and a restored antebellum estate that appeared in architectural magazines but never in gossip columns. No social media. No interviews. A photograph from a charity gala, dated 3 years ago, in which he stood at the edge of the frame looking exactly as he had in my diner booth, still, watchful, separate from the room in some fundamental way that the camera had somehow caught. I stared at that photograph for longer than I should have. Then I closed the tab and went to bed. On Friday morning, there was a car outside my apartment building. Not parked nearby. Outside. A black car, idling at the curb with the quiet confidence of something that had been sent rather than driven there by chance. I stood at my second-floor window in yesterday's coffee-stained shirt and looked down at it for a full minute before I accepted what I already knew. I went downstairs. The driver didn't speak. He opened the rear door with the practiced neutrality of someone paid never to have opinions, and I got in because, and I want to be honest with you here, I got in because I'd been making the safe choice for a decade, and I was tired in a way that safety couldn't fix anymore. Damon was already inside. He looked the same as he had Tuesday night. Immaculate. Unhurried. That quality of stillness that wasn't peace but was something older than peace. The stillness of something that has outlasted its own urgency. He was holding a folder, which he set aside when I sat down, and he looked at me with those wrong-colored eyes and said, without preamble, "I'd like to offer you a position." I looked at him. Personal assistant to the administrative operations of the Ho-Chin Group, he continued, as though this were a perfectly ordinary sentence to say to a woman he'd met once, in a diner at midnight. Scheduling, correspondence, coordination of our legitimate business holdings. The estate operates as our primary base. You'd be on site most days. You don't know anything about me, I said. I know you're methodical, observant, That you understand people's real intentions faster than they'd like. That you've been working below your capacity for years because being underestimated felt safer than being seen. He paused. I know you haven't used your degree in 7 years. The air left my lungs in a slow, quiet way that didn't show on my face. I'd learned to do that, absorb impact without visible reaction. Another thing the marriage had taught me that I'd kept after it ended. What degree? My voice was careful. Business Administration. University of Alabama, 2008. Summa cum laude. The faintest thing moved in his expression. Not a smile. Something more restrained than a smile. You were remarkable once, Alexa. Before you decided remarkable was dangerous. The thing about being known, the real thing, the thing nobody tells you, is that it doesn't always feel like warmth. Sometimes it feels like exposure. Like standing in a room where all the walls have suddenly gone transparent, and you realize too late that you've been hiding in plain sight and someone, finally, looked closely enough to see through. My eyes stung. I didn't let them. The salary, he said, and named a number. I won't tell you what it was. I'll tell you it was more than I'd made in the last 3 years combined. I'll tell you it was the kind of number that would mean I could stop the overnight shifts, stop the hotel laundry work, stop the particular quiet desperation of a life held together with secondhand furniture and careful budgeting and the stubborn refusal to admit I was drowning. Every rational part of me cataloged the reasons to say no. I didn't know this man. I didn't know what he was, and I did know, somewhere below the level of reason, that whatever he was, it was not entirely what I understood the world to contain. The diner. The name. The photograph where he stood at the edge of the frame like a man who'd been attending human gatherings for so long he'd perfected the posture without ever quite belonging to them. I knew. I didn't know the specifics yet, but I knew the shape of the thing I was being asked to walk toward. And here is what 38 years of living teaches you that 22 never could. Sometimes the thing that scares you most is not the danger. Sometimes the thing that scares you most is the possibility. The terrifying, unbearable possibility that something real is being offered. And if you say no, if you choose safe, again, one more time, the way you've been choosing safe since the grief hollowed you out, and your husband left, and your mother forgot your face, you will spend the rest of your life wondering what you were too afraid to become. I thought about my mother's ring, about the way he'd held it before handing it back, carefully, like it mattered, like I mattered, before he'd had a single reason to believe I did. When do I start? I asked. Something shifted in his eyes. Not surprise. Something quieter than surprise. Something that looked, briefly and terrifyingly, like relief. Monday, he said. The car moved through Birmingham's Friday morning streets, and I watched the city I'd been invisible in for years slide past the tinted window, and I felt, for the first time in longer than I could name, like something was beginning. I didn't know yet what it would cost me. I knew it would cost me everything. I said yes anyway. The estate sat 12 miles outside Birmingham on a road that didn't appear on any map I could find. That should have told me something.
It did tell me something.
I filed it in the same drawer where I'd been filing everything about Damon Hochin since Tuesday night. The drawer labeled things I'm not ready to look at directly yet, and I showed up Monday morning in my best blazer with a legal pad and a working pen, because whatever else was true, I still needed this job. The house was antebellum, fully restored, the kind of structure that makes you understand why people use the word breathe about buildings. It breathed. Slowly, deeply, the way very old things breathe, like it had been inhaling and exhaling for so long it had developed its own rhythm, its own interior weather. The columns along the front portico were bone white in the morning light. Wisteria climbed the east wall. The gardens were immaculate in a way that felt less like maintenance and more like devotion. I stood at the front steps for a moment before going in. There are places that hold history in their walls like heat. You can feel it when you walk close to them. The weight of everything that happened here, everything that was built and broken and survived. This was one of those places. Except the history I felt pressing through the stone wasn't measured in decades. It was measured in centuries. A woman met me at the door. Her name was Briar. She had the kind of face that would be difficult to age, somewhere between 35 and 135, with gray eyes that took me in the way an archivist takes in a new document. Not unkind, careful. She showed me to my office, a room off the main corridor, high-ceilinged, with tall windows overlooking the garden, and explained my responsibilities in a voice so precise it felt scripted. Schedules, correspondence, coordination of what she called the group's administrative concerns.
She didn't look at me when she said it.
Before she left, she paused at the door with her hand on the frame. She didn't turn around. "You'll notice things," she said quietly. "My advice is to notice them privately before you ask about them out loud." Then she was gone. I stood in my new office and understood, with a specific clarity that comes from having already survived one life that turned out to be something other than what it appeared, that I had walked into something I did not yet have language for. So I did what I have always done when the ground shifts beneath me. I got to work. Within 3 days, I had mapped the visible architecture of the estate's operations. Real estate holdings across 6 states. Investment portfolios that were decades old in some cases, older in their documentation than the companies managing them should have been able to confirm. A correspondence network that operated on protocols I'd never encountered in any business context I knew. And the visitors. They came in the evenings, mostly. After dark, always. Men and women in expensive clothes who moved through the estate's corridors with a familiarity that spoke of long history, not employees, not clients, something that didn't have a clean corporate name. They arrived in ones and twos and were shown into a wing of the house I had not been given access to, and they did not leave until hours later, and when they passed me in the corridor, they looked at me with a particular expression I came to recognize quickly. Assessment. The specific, unhurried assessment of something, deciding whether you are a threat, an asset, or an inconvenience. I smiled pleasantly and said nothing, and watched everything. I noticed which ones Damon greeted with formal deference and which he simply acknowledged. I noticed the older man, silver-haired, unhurried, with a stillness that made even Damon seem restless by comparison, who arrived every Thursday and left every Thursday with the satisfied expression of someone who believes they are managing a situation. I would learn later that his name was Revered Aldrich. I noted him before I knew his name because of the way the room changed when he entered it. Not fear, exactly. Something older than fear. The specific recalibration of a space around something with absolute authority. I noticed the woman who came twice in the first week and never came through the front. Tall, dark-haired, dressed in a way that belonged to no particular decade. She looked at me once from across the garden, through the window glass, and smiled with her mouth only. It did not reach anything behind her eyes. I wrote her down in my legal pad under a column I'd labeled "Watch carefully," and underlined it twice. I noticed that Briar sometimes stood at the end of corridors watching me work with that expression she'd arrived with, part recognition, part grief, the look of someone who has seen this story before and hasn't decided yet whether the ending can be different. And I noticed Damon noticing me notice all of it. He said nothing. For 11 days he said absolutely nothing about what I was clearly, methodically, undeniably piecing together. He reviewed correspondence with me. He answered scheduling questions. He was present and professional and said everything except the thing that was filling every room we shared like smoke. On the 11th day, I closed the door to his office, sat down across from his desk, folded my hands in my lap, and said, "Tell me what you are." He looked at me for a long moment. Outside, the Alabama dusk was settling into the wisteria. The estate was breathing its slow, old breath around us. Somewhere in the other wing, something ancient was in session. He said, "You already know." "I want to hear you say it." Another silence. The kind that holds weight. Then,
"Yes."
"You do." Not an evasion. A confirmation. Quiet and absolute, the way he did everything. I sat with it. The word I'd been circling for 11 days. The thing the marble floors and centuries-deep stillness and wrong-colored eyes had been telling me since the first night. I sat with it the way you sit with a diagnosis you already suspected, not shocked, just finally, exhaustedly certain. Then I picked up my legal pad. Thursday's visitor, I said. The silver-haired man. What's his role in the council hierarchy? Damon blinked. It was the first time I'd seen him look anything close to surprised. You're not leaving, he said. I'm not leaving, I confirmed. I'm trying to understand the organizational structure I'm working inside of.
Now.
Thursday's visitor. He looked at me for another long moment, and something in his expression shifted in a way I felt rather than saw. Something that had been held at a careful, deliberate distance moved slightly closer. His name is Revered Aldrich, he said. And you're right to have noticed him. I wrote the name down. My hand was steady. I was proud of that. Inside my chest, something was shaking, not with fear, exactly, but with the particular trembling of a woman who has just confirmed that the world is larger and stranger and more dangerous than she was raised to believe, and who is choosing, with full knowledge of that fact, to stay at the table anyway. I had spent 10 years making myself small enough that nothing could touch me. And here I was, sitting across from something ancient and dangerous and real, asking questions and writing down the answers. My mother would have understood. She was the one who taught me that courage isn't the absence of knowing better. It's doing the thing anyway, with both eyes open, because the alternative, the small, safe life, the careful, invisible life, is its own kind of dying. I thought about her ring on my finger. I thought about her voice saying my name like it meant something. And I stayed. You learn a person the way you learn a landscape. Not all at once. Not from a single vantage point. You learn them in fragments. The angle of light at a certain hour. The way the terrain shifts after rain. The places that look solid until you step close enough to see the fault lines running through. You learn them by what surprises you. By what you didn't expect to find. I hadn't expected Damon Ho-Chin to be lonely. That sounds presumptuous. I know that. A vampire king, ancient and untouchable, presiding over a court that had operated for centuries before I was born. Lonely seems like the wrong word. Too small. Too human. But loneliness isn't about being alone. I know that better than most. Loneliness is about being surrounded by people who see the version of you that's useful to them, and never, not once, not for a single unguarded moment, seeing the rest. I recognized it because I had been wearing the same thing in a different fabric for a decade. Weeks passed. The estate settled into a rhythm around me, and I settled into it the way water settles into a new container, taking the shape of what held me while remaining, quietly, entirely myself. I learned the schedule of the council's movements. I learned which correspondence required immediate attention and which was political theater dressed as urgency. I learned that Breyer left a single white magnolia on the windowsill of my office every Monday morning and never once acknowledged doing it, and that this was, I eventually understood, the closest she came to saying I see you. And I learned Damon. Gradually. The way you're not supposed to learn someone you work for. He read in the evenings, when the council business was finished and the estate went quiet. Old books, genuinely old, the kind with handwritten marginalia and languages I couldn't always identify. He held them carefully the way you hold things that have survived longer than they were supposed to. Sometimes I'd pass his study and see him there in the lamplight, perfectly still, and the stillness would have a different quality than his daytime stillness, less controlled, more honest. Like a man who only let himself be a person when he thought no one was watching. He listened to music I didn't recognize. One evening I stood in the corridor outside his study for longer than I should have, listening to something that sounded like it belonged to a century I'd never lived through, something that moved the way grief moves, slowly, with great weight, arriving in waves. When I asked him about it the next morning, he said only that it had been composed by someone he'd known. Past tense. The particular past tense of someone for whom loss is not history, but weather. I didn't ask more. I wrote it in the drawer of my chest where I kept the things about him I wasn't ready to look at yet. He noticed everything about me. I want to say that carefully because being noticed is not always what it sounds like. Being noticed by the wrong person is just surveillance wearing a warmer coat. But this was different. This was the noticing of someone who pays attention because they genuinely cannot help it, because the world, after centuries, has mostly stopped surprising them, and you are, inexplicably, still surprising them. He noticed that I took my coffee, with 1 sugar before noon and none after. That I gravitated to the left side of every room, positioning myself near exits without appearing to. That when I was performing calm, when I was holding something difficult behind my professional face, I touched my mother's ring with my thumb, a small unconscious rotation, clockwise, 3 times. He never said anything about it. But I'd catch him watching my hand sometimes. Not invasively. The way you watch something you're trying to understand, without disturbing. It undid me, slowly, in ways I didn't have words for yet. I'd been invisible for so long. And now someone was watching me with the careful attention of a man cataloging something rare, something he hadn't encountered before, something he was afraid of getting wrong, and the woman I'd spent 10 years compressing down to nothing kept trying to stand up straighter every time I walked into a room he was in.
That terrified me.
The wanting to be seen. The wanting full stop. I'd locked that away after the marriage. After the grief. I decided that wanting things left you open in ways that the world would eventually, reliably, use against you. I decided that the quiet life, the careful life, was the only life with a survivable cost. And then there was him. Ancient and broken and armored in ways I was only beginning to map. And somehow, inexplicably, my wanting had found the one crack in the wall and was pushing through it like a weed through concrete, not dramatic, not fast, just relentless. The night it changed, I was finishing correspondence past midnight. The estate had gone deep quiet around me. I heard him in the doorway before I saw him. That particular quality of air displacement that I'd learned meant he was near, the way a room holds its breath slightly differently when he enters it. "Why did you stay?" he asked. After I confirmed what I was. "You could have left." I set down my pen. I thought about the careful answer. I thought about the professional answer. Then I thought about my mother's ring and the decade of safe choices and the woman who used to be remarkable before she decided remarkable was too dangerous to survive. "I've spent enough of my life running from things that scared me," I said. "I'm not doing it anymore." The silence that followed was the longest I'd ever sat inside. I didn't fill it. I've learned that some silences need to finish themselves. When I finally looked up, something in his expression had changed. Not much. A hairline shift. The kind of change you'd miss if you hadn't spent weeks learning the landscape of his face, by what surprised it, by where the fault lines ran. But I'd learned it, and what I saw stopped my breath quietly in my chest. He looked, for just a moment, like a man who had been waiting a very long time to hear someone say exactly that. We didn't touch. Nothing was said that couldn't be walked back. The professional distance between us technically remained, but something had crossed it anyway. And we both knew it, and neither of us pretended otherwise. Breyer told me. Not directly, she wouldn't do it directly. I'd learned that much about her by then. She told me the way she told me everything that mattered, sideways, in the space between ordinary words, trusting me to be paying attention. She came into my office on a Wednesday morning with a set of revised correspondence files and set them on my desk and said, without looking at me, "The Thursday schedule has been restructured." Revered Aldrich requested a private administrative review. A pause, thin as paper, of all recent personnel decisions. She left before I could respond. I sat with it for exactly 4 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall, the old one with the brass face that had been keeping time in this estate since before my grandmother was born, and I gave myself 4 minutes to feel what I felt, the cold recognition, the particular sick weight of learning you've been discussed, evaluated, considered a problem by people who haven't introduced themselves to your face. 4 minutes. Then I picked up my legal pad and walked down the corridor to Damon's study and knocked once and opened the door.
He was at his desk.
He looked up, and something moved in his expression immediately, a fractional tightening, a recognition. He knew why I was there. He'd been waiting for me to find out, I realized. Not with dread. With something quieter than dread. Almost resignation. Aldrich requested a personnel review, I said. I didn't sit down. Specifically targeting recent hires. Specifically me. Yes. And you shut it down. Yes. Without telling me. He said nothing, which was its own answer. I had spent the 4 minutes at my desk deciding what kind of woman I was going to be in this moment. I'd had a version of this conversation before, in a different room, a different life, with a man who made decisions around me and about me while explaining that he was protecting me, while the protection slowly became a cage I didn't recognize as one until the door had been closed for years. I knew what it felt like to be managed by someone who believed their management was love. I knew what it cost. I will not be administered, I said. Not by Aldrich. Not by you. If something is happening in this court that involves my position, my safety, or my continued presence here, I need to know about it. Not after. Not when you've already handled it. When it happens. Alexa. I'm not asking for protection. I'm asking for honesty. There's a difference. You know there's a difference. The study was quiet. Outside, the Alabama afternoon was doing something golden and heavy with heat, light pressing through the tall windows in long amber bars. The old clock somewhere down the corridor marked the hour. Damon set down his pen. He looked at me for a long moment with those centuries-deep eyes, and I watched him make a decision. Watched the moment he chose the harder thing. Sit down, he said. Please. I sat. And he told me everything. Revered Aldrich had held a senior position in the Ho-Chin court for longer than most of the estate's architecture had been standing. He believed, with the absolute conviction of someone who had never had that conviction seriously challenged, that mortal attachments were a contamination, a vulnerability that weakened bloodline authority, invited exploitation, and historically, reliably ended in catastrophe. He had watched it happen before. He had, Damon said carefully, helped ensure that it happened before, when he believed the court required it. My hands were still in my lap. Then there was Duchess Isolde. Ancient, rival, patient in the way that only centuries of waiting can make a person patient. She had been building a claim against the Ho-Chin throne for longer than my country had existed. She needed a fracture point. She needed something that would make Damon look weak, distracted, compromised. A mortal woman in his inner circle, clearly more than professional, clearly more than temporary. I was a gift to her. A narrative she could use. The court has rules, Damon said, about mortal attachments. They are not forbidden, but they are marked. They become political. Every person who resents me, every faction that wants the throne, every elder who believes I've held power too long, they look at you and they see a lever. I listened. I absorbed it. I did the thing I'd learned to do across years of surviving things that required complete clarity. I let the full weight of it land without flinching away from any part of it. And what do you see? I asked quietly, when you look at me? The silence that followed was the kind that changes the air pressure in a room. He stood, walked to the window. His back was to me, and I could see the tension in his shoulders, the particular tension of a man holding something that has become too heavy to hold comfortably, but who has held it so long he doesn't know how to put it down. I see someone I have no right to put in danger, he said. That's not what I asked. He turned. And what was in his face in that moment? I want to find the right words for it because it deserves the right words. It was the expression of a man who has lived long enough to know exactly what he's feeling and exactly what it will cost him, and who is standing at that knowledge the way you stand at the edge of something very high, understanding the drop completely. Don't expect love from me, he said.
His voice was low.
Steady. The steadiness of something enormous being held very carefully. I don't know how to do that anymore without it becoming a weapon used against both of us. The room was absolutely still. I heard it for exactly what it was. Not a rejection. Not a wall. A confession dressed in warning clothing, spoken by a man who had loved before and watched it become the instrument of destruction for everyone involved, who had spent centuries reinforcing the belief that caring for something mortal was an act of cruelty toward yourself, and who was standing in front of me saying don't expect it in a voice that told me he was already terrified of how much he meant it. I know that voice. I have spoken in that voice. In the years after the marriage, after my mother, when someone would get too close and something in me would start to reach toward them, and I would pull back, hard, and say something careful and deflecting, not because I didn't feel it, but because I felt it too much, and feeling it too much when you've already been broken once is its own specific terror. I recognized him.
Completely.
I didn't say so. Not yet. Some truths need to be held privately before they're spoken aloud, or the speaking of them frightens them back into silence. I simply looked at him across that sun-filled room, and I nodded once, and I said, "All right." And I picked up my legal pad. And I went back to work. But something had been named between us now. Something that couldn't be unnamed. And we both knew it, and we both carried it, and the weight of it was different from the weight of anything I'd carried in a long time. It was heavy the way hope is heavy. Like something worth the cost of holding. If this story is reaching something in you that you didn't expect, something you thought you'd put away, you're not alone here. There are women who found their way to this channel and never quite left, because some stories don't just entertain you. They find you. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Not for the next upload. For this feeling. So, you know where to come back to when you need it again.